You don't know my story, and I don't know your story. And everybody has a story. Everybody have a story. Look at me. I'm sure you think you know my story. I think I know your story. But you can't look at me and tell what my story is. So let me share a little bit about my story. I was born into a single parent home, which did not start it like that. I was born into a single parent mother home. A mother who was an alcoholic. Do I look like that? You don't know my story, and I don't know your story. But as a daughter of a single mother, as a daughter of a single mother alcoholic, you look at me, but you don't know my story. And I don't know your story. What's my story? Just think about it. Growing up in a home of an alcoholic mother, but then you still think you know my story, but you don't. My mother, she didn't start out being an alcoholic. She was a wife, a mother of a 1-year-old, and getting ready to be a mother of another. A mother who was 7 months pregnant, who stayed at home. She was a stay-at-home mom. She was a stay-at-home wife. And what happened? On payday, one Friday, her husband didn't come home. So this mother, who was a stay-at-home mom, who was a stay-at-home wife, found herself in a situation that she never expected. She found herself abandoned by her husband. Her children, a child-to-be and a 1-year-old, abandoned by their father. You don't know my story, and I don't know yours. And no one knew my mother's. All they knew is that she was an alcoholic. An alcoholic, that's what they saw. But they didn't know her story. Can you imagine? You are a wife, and next thing you know, you are a single mother. And next thing you know, you are a mother without income. So what happened? After she had her child, 2 months later, my mother became an alcoholic. That wasn't her plan for her life, but that's how it was. You don't know my story, and I don't know your story. What's your story? This is only the beginning of mine. This is the beginning of my life. I was the child that she was carrying. But one thing I can say about my mother, regardless, she loved me. You couldn't look at her and tell it because of her state. But her actions showed me that she loved me. And people did not know her story. If you knew her story, would you have looked at her different? If you knew my story, what would you say? People look at me and think they know me, but you don't know me because you don't know my story. And I can look at you and I don't know you unless I know your story. But one thing I can tell you, your story does not make you who you are. Because if you knew my whole story, you would think I should have turned out different. But one thing, my story changed because of God. God had his hands on my life from a very small child. Because think about it. Growing up in a single parent home, the parent who was an alcoholic, how do you think I should have turned out? What would you think? Growing up with me, how should I have looked as an adult? Looking at me today, you would guess something totally different. You don't know my story, and I don't know your story. Everybody has a story, good, bad, or indifferent. But one thing I can tell you, your story don't make you. You make your story. Your story happens to you in the beginning, but it's not your end. You make your story. You can change your life. You can. You are not a product of your environment. People say that, but is it true? No. Look at me. You don't know my story. And you don't know my mom's story. My mother was a loving woman, even though you may not know it, or you may not have known it if you knew her. My mother loved me, but it took me becoming an adult to know her story. And how would I have reacted? Would I have reacted the same way my mom did? Would I have turned to alcohol? Would I have turned to drugs? Or would I have turned to something else if I found myself in the same state? You tell me, how would you have found yourself? You can't look at people and know their story. You have to ask them what their story is. I met a young lady today, and looking at her, she's so beautiful and she's so friendly. And I thought, by looking at her, that I would know her story. But I don't know her story. You would have never guessed what this young lady has gone through in the years that she have been on this earth. You would have never guessed that she was smiling at people and happy to see people. I didn't know her story until she told me her story. You don't know my story, and I don't know your story. What's your story? But don't know that your story can change. Your story, you can write your story. It doesn't have to be what it used to be. What's your story? My story? I am a child of an alcoholic. I'm a child of a woman who didn't expect her life to be what it was. I'm a child of a woman who I know loved me. I am a child of a woman who was the best cook I knew. I am a child of a woman who did not abandon me. She could have. In the state that she was in, she could have abandoned me and my brother and my sister. You don't know my story, and I don't know yours. So tell me, what's your story? Sit back and think about your story. But let me tell you, your story don't make you. You make your story. Yes, growing up, your story is what it is. But your story doesn't have to end that way. You don't know my story, and I don't know your story. But I'm sharing my story with you to let you know that your story don't make you. You make your story. You can change your story. I am a firm believer that you can do whatever you want to do. I'm a firm believer that you can be whoever you want to be. I'm a firm believer that God has a purpose for each and every one of us. And my purpose is to help you rewrite your story. Thank you, and stay tuned.